Hello everybody, welcome to another week in review, this time suggested by Branson Salinger, who suggested we do 9th Guard Cavalry as well as 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific decks in this series, post them in the comments below and we'll either route you to the video where those already exist or I'll get to them in chronological order. Just to let everybody know where the schedule is currently at, next week we have 3rd Canadian Mechanized, as well as 78th Sturm, and the following week we have 2nd Guard Tankovi and 352nd on the Axis side. So after those will be when we get to the next couple comments. Also, as a brief aside, I wanted to state for the record that these decks that I make are exclusively for team games. I don't play a lot of 1v1s, but I imagine that all of these decks would not work very well in 1v1s. I know I've said this before, but I just want to make it absolutely clear that these decks are exclusively for team games. With all that out of the way though, let's hop right into the decks and give them a look. On screen now is my first iteration of the 9th Guard Cavalry. As you can see, I kind of went for more of a Maverick or Vanguard feel with a balanced deployment type, and I'm not exactly sure why I did that. However, it did work fairly well. In the Recon tab, I'm bringing in a card of Phase A Oznaz Sappery, which were kind of killing it for me. These guys come with the TNT as well as 4 PPSH 43s, and they excel at those close quarters of combats inside of forests or inside of cities. In fact, one of the only changes that I made to this deck throughout the week was to move those into a later phase in order to get more of them. However, I also have a card of the Phase A Oznaz Snippery, and these guys were also great. However, being that they're only 2 per card, and once a sniper is seen, it's almost always obliterated by tanks or artillery, these guys didn't perform as well for me. In the Infantry tab, I decided to steer into the skid. Being that this is an infantry division, I upvetted quite a few of my infantry to reflect that. So the command structure was quite strong and my Kazaki were almost always at 3 stars whenever in combat. I bring in a Phase A card of 1-star Kazaki coming in at 8 per card, which is only 1 fewer than typical rifle units come in at that same phase, at no stars. I also bring in a card of Phase A Oznaz and a card of Phase B Oznaz. I was using these guys by turning off the SVT and kind of sneaking them around through light cover or through heavy forest to kill tanks. Being that they have a bazooka, these guys should only be used as a bazooka unit. They kind of suck as anything else. Being that they're only 4 men, they're taken out quite easily by anything that looks at them. The 3 SVTs are nice, but they're not great at laying down suppressive fire, being that there are only 3 of them. And their other weapon is a PPSH, so it's really close range. So if you're looking to use the Oznaz for anything intelligent, I would suggest using them as a dedicated anti-tank squad and really nothing else. Aside from those, I bring in a card of the Phase A Kazaki Komrodi, just to get that command structure online that I was talking about earlier. The Kazaki Komrodi come with the smoke grenades as well as quite a few members, and so they're invaluable to this deck. In Phase B, I bring in a card of the Kazaki, also at 1 star, and the Kazaki SVT, again at 1 star. The Kazaki SVT are literally just Kazaki, but with SVTs. I know, crazy, right? But more SVTs, I should say. Finally, in Phase C, I bring in a card of the Kazaki Mazen, as well as a card of the Sappery. The main reason I went with the Sappery is because my only other options were very close ranged, and I don't really like the close ranged engaged units that they had access to, such as the Automachiki or such not. The Kazaki PPSH are another option in this tab, but they're not great. Being that they lack the same Molotov cocktail that the Tanko Desantniki use, these guys just kind of die whenever they get into melee combat with anything with flamethrowers or with a grenade of their own. And being that a German player is going to be remiss by just sending things into a forest without a grenade or a flamethrower, I find that these guys oftentimes don't perform all that well. The Sappery at least come in with SVTs as well as a DP to get that mid to long ranged engagement, as well as the grenade should I need to send them through the forest, so I think these guys are the go-to. In the Tank tab, which in this deck should be renamed to the Sherman tab, I bring in a card of Phase A T-3476s just to get that early tank online. Being that these guys are so cheap and come in at 8 per card, they're a great option for that early income phase. I also bring in a card of Phase A Emchas, and I'm doing that at 1 star because you only lose 1 if you bring them in at 1 star. In Phase B, I have 2 cards of 1 star Emchas, as well as the Emcha Komrodi, and That's so fairly self-explanatory why I'm bringing in the Emchas. The Emcha is a great tank, it's at a reasonable price, it boxes with most enemy tanks at a kilometer, and it just excels at infantry support. And being that this deck is mostly an infantry deck, that's great, that's exactly what I needed it for. In the support tab, I have a Phase A card of the Ognamachiki coming in the WLA motorbike, which is really just a staple of my decks, as well as a Phase A card of the Ford GPA Snab. These guys, I only ever bring in the Phase A supplies when they come in these Jeep supply trucks, and I think they're only found in this deck and a few of the British divisions, as well as a few Axis divisions, but I don't remember which ones off the top of my head. These just help me keep my infantry supplied should they run out of ammunition, should the Oznaz run out of bazooka rounds, or so on, and being that they still come in at 4 per card, they're not quite as worthless as bringing in a Phase A card of the Studebaker supply trucks. I also bring in a Phase A card of the OB-25 76.2mm. Again, self-explanatory, these guns are fantastic, they do an excellent job of pinning down infantry or taking out lighter vehicles. A Phase A card of the Combat, which again a staple for me, and a Phase B Studebaker Snab. In the anti-tank tab, I had something of a stroke and brought in the Kazaki PTRS teams, but I did it in the DZHIP instead of in the WLA, rendering them completely worthless to my plans. I brought in a card of the Phase A M42s and a Phase A card of Ziz 2s. The Ziz 2s in this deck actually ended up picking up quite a few heavy tanks because I think most Axis players forget that 9th Guard has access to a 57mm gun and so kind of just charge their heavy tanks with reckless abandon at them. In the anti-air tab, I skipped out on the Ziz 12 for what I feel is a good reason. In Phase A, I brought in the Zenart 37mm coming in the Dushka, and Phase C I did the same thing. In Phase C, I also brought in the Zenart 44 85mm, but I did not do it in the supply truck because it just got too expensive that way. The main reason that I skipped out on the Ziz 12 and did the Zenart 85 instead is because this deck really has a lack of anti-tank weapons, and so I brought in the Zenart 85s to sort of double as anti-tank and anti-air units. In the artillery tab, I brought in the DZHIP artillery observer with the 152mm to get those early footholds TM, as well as a card of the A19 122mm coming in the supply truck. Now, something to note about the A19 122. The A19 is the exact same gun that the IS-2 1943 uses. This weapon, while at an abysmal accuracy, which is really par for the course for the Russians, does sport a 200mm penetration value and does 12 damage per shot. So this thing is the bane of heavy tanks if you get it into the right spot. Add this to the fact that you can hide this in a heavy forest and put it on efficient shot to snipe the side armor on tanks, and you have a really deadly weapon. However, what you need to bear in mind is, if this thing fires more than once, it's dead. It's definitely dead, there's no way it's ever leaving. If it fires once, there's a good chance that it's dead. These things are slow, they're huge, they're very low man for what they're worth, and being that they have such an abysmal accuracy, they oftentimes don't hit with their first shot, which is kind of frustrating, but I found that these guys were worth the points more often than not. In the air tab, I was bringing in the LA-7 in Phase A at 2 stars, just because I only wanted to buy one air superiority fighter and I wanted it to do its job. The LA-7 was good enough for what it's worth, however it wasn't quite as good as a Tempest would have been. But then again, what is? In Phase B, I bring in a card of the Lag 3 Series 3/4s, the anti-tank rocket planes. These guys kind of suck. I'm not going to lie to you, these don't really kill tanks all that efficiently. I found that spamming the Tu-2S was a much more reliable way to kill a tank than using these actual dedicated anti-tank planes. Occasionally, though, they would find the side armor on something and actually kill it, and that was interesting enough to see. I also have a Phase B card of the Tu-2S, a Phase C card of the Tu-2S, and another Phase C card of the Tu-2S, just with different variants of bombing munitions, and these things all excel at what they do. They're practically just the PE2s of this deck in that they drop horrific amounts of munitions and oftentimes make it out due to their high resilience and relatively high speed. Come the end of the week, as I said at the onset of this, I brought in the Oznaz Sappery in Phase B just to get 3 more of them per card. These things really overperformed for me, and they kind of acted as my Tanko Desetniki in lieu of actually having Tanko Desetniki. We see no more changes until the AT tab, where I brought in the Kazaki PTRSs in the proper motorbike, which, shocker, should have done that all along. And that's really all that changed throughout the week. I would have liked to change a few more things, however there were just no better options than what I had. I found that 9th Guard is kind of a niche division in a lot of ways. It purports to be an infantry division, and its infantry are quite decent at mid-ranged engagements. It's not great, however, at close-range or long-ranged engagements, and honestly, even though it's able to spam much more than the German variants, these guys aren't terribly much better than the Panzer Grenadier. The MCHO is a huge boon for this deck, and it was really helpful in suppressing those MG42s or whatever it was that the Germans were using at the time before they were able to kill too many of my infantry. The support tab in this deck is really bloated. I would have liked to see something like a card of SG43s or a captured MG42, however all they have access to in the way of support guns is the OB25 and the Maxim, and I don't trust the Maxim at all. The anti-tank tab was also quite bloated, and I would have liked to bring in a card of the Ziz 3s just as a phase B sort of round out my AT tab, however 3 points per card is a lot at that phase. The anti-air tab was also kind of bloated. I would have loved to bring in the Ziz 12, but I just couldn't find a way to fit it in there, being that it was 3 or 4 points per card at that late stage of the AA tab. The artillery tab could have used some more things in it, however I just don't enjoy using artillery and I don't trust the Katyusha. I'd say that the air tab really shined, however anything that costs that much points might as well shine. The PE2, TU2S, or AC-20 Bostons in enough numbers will kill anything you send them at, regardless of enemy anti-aircraft weapons. That said, it's the amount of planes that you have to purchase in this tab in order to actually accomplish that really sets it apart. I would venture to say that if you spent upwards of 800 points on any unit in the game, it would perform really well. However, that's really all that this deck has going for it, is that gratuitous amount of planes. The A-19 hardly ever hit, and I would have liked to get some footage of it actually killing a King Tiger or something of actual consequence, but every time I brought it up, it just kind of got killed by artillery. As it stands, I think that this deck is actually quite weak. It doesn't have a lot of areas where it really shines, and the areas where it does shine aren't really quite as bright as I'd like. The AA tab is quite standard. Other than the Ziz 12, it features no unique units, and the Ziz 12 really doesn't help this deck, being that it's not terribly good at advancing. Add on top of this the fact that the Ziz 12 is actually quite squishy, and you're just bringing in a unit that's going to die if you do bring it in. It's just a truck with a gun on the back and a guy firing at the sky, so it's not terribly well defended. Despite what I have featured here, I think that this deck should be either a Juggernaut division that relies a lot on spam in order to carry it through that sort of Phase F gameplay, or a Vanguard deployment that really pushes hard in Phase A. Even though the Kazaki aren't fantastic, enough of them in Phase A would overwhelm any force. Overall, my biggest indictment of this deck is the fact that it does not perform well on its own merits. It has AT, it has infantry, it has tanks, but none of these things are good enough to repel borders against any specific enemy division. If you're fighting against an Axis armored deck, then the Tiger's just going to tear everything in this deck to shreds, save for the Ziz 2 and the Zenard 85, however you only have a very limited number of those. If you're fighting against an enemy infantry division, say Sturm for example, the Begleit series infantry or the Sturmschützen are just going to tear your infantry to shreds and probably come out at more than a 3-to-1 kill death. Every time I played this division throughout the week, which was only about 5 times to be honest, I found that I was really struggling to have an answer to anything in any given phase. I found that in any given phase I didn't have enough infantry, but there was really nothing I could do about that save for dropping the Oznaz cards. I found I also didn't have enough Emchas to really affect change in the late game, and I didn't have enough AT guns to repel even a single Panther most times. Honestly, I think that this division would really excel at a 1v1, being that all of its units are fantastic on their own point value, if that makes sense. They're all amazing at holding their own ground against similar point values on the opposing team. However, in a more concentrated front that you're liable to see in a team game, you're just going to crumble under the weight of any Axis division in my experience. Even the times that I was able to get the upper hand, it wasn't due to the deck being better, it was due to the enemy player being worse at the game than I was. And while this is often the case in almost any matchup, it felt exclusively strong here. I would say that this deck is actually very, very difficult to play in a team game properly if you can't get that early foothold and can't get things into the correct positions for ambushes or side armor shots with your Ziz-2s or your A-19s. I did one game throughout the week where I went into a forest against a Romanian division, and the Romanians just kicked my ass out of there. Even when I was taking engagements far enough away to avoid their flame units, this deck really did not perform well enough to justify its existence. I found that by the late game, I only won because I had more TU2Ss than is reasonable and just kind of spammed them over and over again to bomb everything to death, which sure might be fun some of the time, but it's not a great way to win. It kind of just smacks of I only beat you because of memes. All in all though, I think there are many better ways to play this deck. However, I was finding that it would have required a complete rework of the deployment type as well as a complete rework of the entire deck in order to make it work. So I guess that this is kind of my failing, but to that same end, none of these units were going to perform well regardless of the deployment type. Moving on though, we have my 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend deck. Now this deck, in opposition to the other one, has very few infantry, and all of their infantry, while very few, are very, very good, and I'll get into more as to why later. In the Recon tab, I bring in the SDKFZ 250/9, just for a 20mm cannon. These things are fantastic at shredding infantry, AT guns, so on. I also bring in a card of the SPW 233s, because these guys have the heat guns, and they have the AP, and they have HE. They're just fantastic at most everything. 35 points, these guys are just a light tank. In the Infantry tab, I bring in a card of the Sturm Pioneer in Phase A Phase A card of Panzer Grenadier, 2 Phase B cards of Panzer Grenadier, and a Phase C card of Panzer Grenadier with the Panzerfaust. All except for the Panzer Grenadier with the Panzerfaust were coming in the half-track transport just for an additional fire support. In the Tank tab, I bring in a Phase A card of 1-star Panther Ds, a Panther D Führer in Phase A Phase B card of Panzer 4Hs, a Phase B card of Panther Ds at 1 star, a Phase B card of Tiger E's at no star, as well as a Phase B card of Tiger E Commander, a Phase C card of the Panzer 4J, a Phase C card of Tiger E's with no stars, and a Phase C card of Panther G's with no stars. This tank tab is full to bursting, and honestly I could see my way into dropping a few of these. However, the Panzer 4s are all fantastic, the Tigers are of course a unit that I worship wholeheartedly, the Panther G's were there exclusively to deal with IS-2s, and the Panther D's kind of just were my anti-tank guns with wheels. In the support tab, I bring in a card of the Phase A Flammenwerfer in the BMW motorbike, a Phase A card of the SMG-42s, a Phase A Commander, a Phase B IG-18, and a Phase B supply truck. In the anti-tank tab, I kind of went insane and brought in a Phase A card of the PaK-40s as well as a Phase B card of the PaK-40s, even though that Phase B card was worth 3 points in the deployment tab. In the anti-air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Flak 38 20mm. They were coming in the SDKFZ 10/4 just to give me that extra bit of AA, but I just don't like the 20mm as a unit. These guys do not tear planes out of the sky, they don't suppress things very well, they're just kind of a waste of points in my hands. I also brought in a Phase A card of the Flak 41 88mm to give me an extra AT gun in Phase A. A Phase B Wirbelwind, and a Phase C Mobilwagen kind of rounded out my actual AA units that were liable to tear units out of the sky, and a Phase C card of Flak 41s, again to round out that AT capability. In the Artillery tab, I brought in a card of the SDKFZ 250/7 mortar trucks, a Phase B card of the Verframen, a Phase C Artillery Commander, and a Phase C card of the 150mm coming in the supply truck. In the Air tab, I brought in a Phase B 2-star card of the ASF FW190s and a Phase C card of the Fighter Bomber variants. The reason I kind of rushed through this is because there's a lot of stuff in this deck that performs a very specific role, and I want to really get into that once you see my ending. Throughout the week, this deck only saw really one change, and that was the dropping of the Phase B PaK-40 75mm and the picking up of the bombers, the JU-188s in Phase C. These just kind of rounded everything out, and being that that was the only change, I just wanted to rush through that before discussing what each unit was actually doing and my thought process for them. The Recon tab functioned as light tanks for Phase A. Being that I didn't have any Panzer IVs until Phase B, I really had nothing that I wasn't afraid to lose, and so I had nothing that could support my infantry other than these units. and they really did excel at that role. In fact, I found that the SPW-233 was almost always worth more to me than the Panther D in that same tab, or rather in that same role. The infantry tab, while sparse, did perform really well for a few reasons. One is that the Hitlerjugend deck features the fanatical unit trait. Being that they have this, they won't surrender under any circumstance. If they're pinned down a mile and a half behind enemy lines with no command, they will still continue to exist there. Because of this, regardless of how well they actually performed in combat, they would hold enemy infantry in a spot for long enough for me to deal with them in due course. On top of this, they all came in the half-track transport save for one card, and so they all had additional sort of support on that front line. Add on top of this the fact that the SPW half-track was not terribly expensive to tack onto the top of the units, and these guys became very, very deadly in their roles. The tank tab performed like you'd think it would in a Hitlerjugend deck. The Panther D I was using mainly as an anti-tank gun. It sat at about 2 kilometers away from any given threat and just fired downrange at it. Save for the IS-2, there's really no way that the allies can deal with this unit, and so I kind of just kept it out of their range at all times. Because of this deck really excelled at holding large swaths of open ground, but did not excel at moving up in that same ground, being that the Panther D is so horrifically vulnerable from the side. Anytime that I was fighting against, say, 6th Airborne or one of the NATO divisions, I found that there were always light anti-tank guns scattered around all around me in forests. However, I rounded this out by bringing in the Panzer IVs, and the Panzer IVs are fantastic. Being that these guys were so inexpensive, I didn't really care if I sent them forward and they died. And so they found a lot of enemy weaknesses and exploited them very efficiently, being that they were so cheap. The Tiger E's, again, are just Tiger E's. You're not going to find a better tank, in my opinion, than the Tiger E. I found that I was just kind of spamming these guys out there, and the main reason I didn't bring in a card of Phase A Tiger E's is because Hitlerjugend doesn't get access to a Phase A card of them. I found that this tank tab really hit a sort of critical mass before terribly long. It sort of piled up these tanks and tanks and tanks, and the more you kept them alive, the more you had. I know, haha, that makes perfect sense. However, this deck snowballs really hard because of that. Sure, when an enemy has 2 Panther Ds, that's difficult to deal with, but every tick they're bringing in an additional Panther D or an additional Tiger E, and so eventually you just have this pile of tanks that's nearly impossible to deal with at this point. Add on top of that the robust rounding out of each tab with Panzer IV H's and J's, and this deck really was hard to deal with on any sort of open ground. I sort of avoided fighting for forests or cities and just sort of encircled them and destroyed them from the outside. The support tab was excellent at supporting infantry, but really nothing stood out here. The IG-18s performed as usual fantastically, and the MG-42s were kind of just an addition to the already horrific amount of MG-42s I had coming in the half-tracks. The anti-tank tab was light to say the least, however the PaK-40 did its job well enough. I found that with the Panther Ds, I really didn't need that much anti-tank capability so long as I was careful with those Panthers. The anti-air tab really didn't see much use in this tab, being that the Mobilwagen or the Wirbelwind were more than enough to deal with enemy aircraft at any given time. Because of this, I only ever brought in all of the AA tab in one game, and it was a really, really long and horrific game that included a lot of shelling of things to death. And so that's where the Mobilwagen and the Wirbelwind really shine, in that you can just keep them on the move. They'll fire on the move, they'll move all the time so the artillery can't get them. They're just amazing like that. The half-track mortar carriers were good enough. They hit something the size of a dime, as I've said before, and they're fantastic for that reason. Add on top of this the Verframen, which is probably the first rocket truck that I actually like using. This thing has 2 salvos of 6 rounds each, and each salvo fires 6 280mm rockets. This is more than enough to deal with any IS-2s or anti-tank lines, and that's what I was using it for, just to try and harry those anti-tank lines or destroy enemy heavy tanks. I brought in the Battery Fuhrer to kind of round out my command, but I found that I wasn't using these guys all that often, being that I had the Tigers and the Panthers still alive from earlier phases. The Phase C card of 150 mils was good, However, I didn't use it all that often because the enemies against this division are unlikely to be able to set up too much battery, and so I found that counter battery was more or less worthless. I was using the JU-188s as sort of my deal with IS-2s option, being that this deck kind of struggles against them. The Panther G is good enough at dealing with IS-2s so long as the IS-2 is within a kilometer. However, getting it to there is sometimes dicey, and sometimes the Verframen is out of ammo, so I just bomb it to death with the JU-188. In direct opposition to 9th Guard Cavalry, I found that this deck was actually really intuitive and worked very, very well in most instances. All of its units performed very, very well, and with the Fanatical trait added on top of all of this, these guys really don't need anything else. Even if all they did with that Fanatical trait was just survive long enough to waste an enemy unit's ammunition, that was more than good enough for me. Most enemy players that are going up against Hitlerjugend, and myself included in this, forget about the Fanatical trait and sit there staring at it like, where's the commander? How is this not surrendering? What's going on right now? And not realizing what they're up against. Add on top of that whenever you take a forest, you're more than likely just going to attack move your units through it, and so they'll just get hung up on these units, just firing endlessly at them, and being that they're pinned down, they're stationary and taking less damage, so it's just a win-win all around. If I was to make one change to this division, I might change the Pak 40 out for a Panzerschreck team, because I didn't find myself using the Pak 40 all that often. The Panther D was more than enough for any given front as an anti-tank weapon, and so the Pak 40 was kind of superfluous. Add on top of this, the only other thing in the anti-tank tab is a card of Jagdpanzer 4s that you could potentially bring in, but again, the Panther D is just a Jagdpanzer 4, but better, so I just didn't see a point in bringing these units in. Honestly, I would have liked to see the anti-tank tab include a Pak 38 card, as that would have been interesting enough to bring in at all times. In case you're curious, the Recon tab doesn't include the Firefly for good reason. I think the Firefly is really overrated. At 95 points, it does not perform at a 95 point tank cost. 15 points cheaper than the Panther D and dies to any enemy vehicle. Regardless of how good its penetration is, it's just not very good at surviving long enough. I tried quite a few times throughout the week to bring in this unit and found that each and every time I was either misusing it or the enemy was just killing it before it was actually effective, and so it was just kind of a waste of points. I found that the Recon tab was also quite bloated with it in there, being that I really wanted the 20 mils and the SPW233, and it just kind of added on top of those, and 2 points for that thing was kind of a bit much. While this deck was quite intuitive for me to use, I could see this being difficult for a newer player to use. The Mobilwagen and Rebelwind require a lot of babysitting in order to properly move out of the way of artillery, as they're quite squishy to artillery. On top of this, there's no intuitive way to deal with IS-2s built into this division, being that there's no Pak 43, no King Tiger, no Jagdpanther, so on. Because of this, if you're going up against an IS-2 division, you're going to have to use a lot of craftiness in order to kill them, or just bomb them to death with the Verframen or the JU-188. I could see that being difficult for newer players to wrap their minds around, as it were. Most players, when they come into this game, and I don't include myself in this mix, think that the Panther should be an unstoppable god machine that's able to kill everything on the enemy team, but at 2 kilometers, it doesn't even scratch the paint on IS-2s, and so I would really avoid 2 kilometer engagements against the likes of 29th Guard, 84th Guard, or 3rd Tankovi. Of course, there are other IS-2 divisions, but just a few to name. Other than that though, 2nd Guard really struggles against this, and several infantry divisions struggle against this for the simple reality that you could just encircle the enemy lines and not deal with their infantry at all. Infantry are worthless if all they've managed to do is take a city that you've completely surrounded with tigers, and as such, this deck really performs well at taking cities, oddly enough. I found that when I went to Lenina at one point, I was able to take the entire middle area simply by driving around the city and ignoring it entirely. All in all though, that's going to do it for this week in review. Next week, as I said before, I have 3rd Canadian Mechanized as well as 78th Sturm. Thank you again for Branson Salinger for this week's suggestion of 9th Guard Cavalry and 12th Panzer SS Hitlerjugend. Thanks for watching everybody, and have an excellent day.